And Anne, am I supposed to show the slides from my screen, or were you doing it?
I think if you could show from your screen, that'd be good. I think when the session just started recorded, I guess so hi everyone, so welcome to another video podcast on telehealth failures and secrets to success. And this week, I'm really excited to have Brad on our show. You probably looking by the number, registration, everything. We can tell right away his topic is just really, really insightful. I think a lot of people would really enjoy what he has to share. I guess before we start, Brad, is there something you can briefly introduce yourself? I mean, people can read your official bio. Is there something like not you typically say in your official bio you want to share with the audience?
Sure. I have two very young kids, and so, you know, going to work is what I do between changing diapers and, trying to get my 2 or 3 hours of sleep every night. So I'm very sensitive to those concerns, and for that reason, I find telehealth even more fascinating every day because I think, boy, if I could just call the physician on my iPhone, that would be so much easier than taking her to the doctor's office.
So how old are your kids?
My oldest is 3, and my youngest is about 10 months.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's the tough time in there. But we have some really interesting telemedicine company. I think you can really benefit from advice and all these things that
Yeah,
will
for sure.
make your life easier.
Yeah, we have back in New Jersey where I lived a couple of years ago. We had a good friend who is he was still doing his residency, and he was in pediatrics. And after we had our first child, I mean, we were calling him constantly. I don't know if he'll take my calls anymore. I'm very interested in the field for sure.
Got it. And also, like, I think something interesting about you used to be a teacher in South Korea and used to be a summer camp bus driver, right? Is that, am I correct? So,
Those are both true. I got my teaching certificate from Michigan State, and I did a lot of children's programs before I got into law. I drove a bus for a summer camp for about a month and a half, and then I think it was probably better off for everyone that I got into an accident, and we said, so I'm very happy that I don't have a CDL license anymore.
got it. Good, awesome in there. I guess, Brad, I know you prepared a couple of slides. We would love to have maybe have you share your insight, and we just open up to the audience for their questions.
Yeah, I have the slides open. I'm trying to find out. Am I sharing my screen?
Yeah, you're sharing your screen. I see the,
Okay.
the editor mode on the.
Okay. Perfect. Um, Here we go. So, my name is Brad Davidson. I'm an Epstein, Becker, and Green. You're going to see a picture of me. Oh, good. The picture didn't show up. But that's my contact information. They'll be in the slides when you get it. I thought I would start with just some really jarring statistics. Drug overdose is now the leading cause of death of Americans 50 and over. And since 1999, right after I graduated from high school, there's been a 500% increase in the number of deaths related to opioids. Last year, no, 2016, we had 64,000 Americans die of overdose. That's more than died in the Vietnam War. It's more than last year died of car crashes and gun violence combined. So it's just a crazy, staggering statistic. We've actually had life expectancy drop for 2 years in a row, and that hasn't happened in almost 60 years. So it's something that people are starting to take more seriously. Are these the right slides? Oh, all right. Sorry, I just got to go back. So the most common treatments, some of the backgrounds aren't showing up. It looked prettier when we did it here, so you'll get your version. You can see how pretty they are later. But the most common treatments for opioid dependence disorder are methadone and Suboxone or buprenorphine. And I know buprenorphine comes in a number of different ways that it can be administered, and the same with methadone. So to some extent, you know, there may always be an in a clinic period for these drugs, but they're both Schedule II, Schedule III controlled substances. So they're very controlled. And in terms of treatment of patients, you have a couple of big issues. One, because they're controlled substances, you're limited in who can write a script for those drugs. And that's, you know, it's only a problem in that there are only so many of those individuals. And then you also have a lack of providers in areas where the opioid crisis has hit hardest, in really rural areas. You just have a low concentration of physicians already, of practitioners, and then of those practitioners, how many have, you know, the expertise to provide this kind of care? Because it's certainly something where you don't need a special license to do it, but having that expert background makes a really big difference in how you're able to best prescribe for your patients, among other things. So those three issues seem like they pave a road to telehealth, to say, all right, well, you know, set up a camera, or through someone's iPhone at home, you can do a combination of therapy, and you know, you can loop in a prescriber who can view the record, store and forward. All of this adds up to a good combination of providing care through telehealth, except that you have the Ryan-Haidt Act. And the Ryan-Haidt Act, which was established in 2008, I'll give you a little background. So Ryan-Haidt was a high school, I think he was a senior, and he was able to procure a lot of narcotics through an online pharmacy. And this was in, I think, 2003, when it was fairly easy to get those kind of things through the internet with no physician interaction. So Congress, it took them, 5 years to write the law, because that's kind of how it works. And the law was intended to stop this from happening. But what it did was it set up these barriers to establishing a physician-patient relationship that would allow you to write a prescription for controlled substances. And it has limited exceptions, but you know, the exceptions are the patient's already in a hospital or a clinic, or they're standing right next to another physician who could write the script. So it's not really an exception, it's just kind of a farce. But even when it was initially written by Congress, they had this thing called the special registration written into the amendments to the Controlled Substances Act, which is supposed to allow DEA to meaningfully, thoughtfully promulgate rules to say, under these circumstances, if you register with us, we'll check your background, we'll do what we feel is necessary to make sure that you are a good risk, if you will, and we'll give you this ability to write prescriptions through telehealth for controlled substances, or maybe even for a very limited number of controlled substances. I mean, it's completely in DEA's hands. That was in 2008. And since 2008, they've done nothing with that special registration, which kind of brings us to where we are today, which is a place where my mouse doesn't work. There we go. So since then, DEA hasn't done anything. However, every single state has come up with telehealth laws that somehow either very directly, very clearly, or at least tangentially talk about the prescription of controlled substances. And I mean, even last year, our firm does it did a survey a couple of years ago, and so many states came up with new laws that we felt like we had to do an amendment, an addendum to it. Otherwise, it would be useless within a year. And I think it was something like 48 of the 50 states, some ridiculous number, changed their telehealth laws in that period of time, in some manner or fashion. So I came up with a list of a couple to kind of give you the idea of just how varied these laws are. So in Michigan, you have a pretty loose standard. It says a health professional who is providing a telehealth service to a patient may prescribe the patient a drug if the health professional is a prescriber who's acting within the scope of his or her practice in prescribing the drug. That's a lot of words to say prescribe like you're supposed to, and that's it. If you are in Michigan pretty soon, you're going to have to act in accordance with the prescription drug monitoring. But I mean, almost every state has a prescription drug monitoring program, so that's not really unique. Otherwise, act within the standard of care, and there is no additional requirement in order to write that script through telehealth. That's very different from other states. Hawaii is closer to Michigan. Hawaii allows for prescribing any drug, except that they have another law that limits prescribing of opiates and medical marijuana. Those cannot be done through telehealth, but otherwise, any other controlled substance you are able to prescribe in Hawaii. And then in Indiana has something that's really great, and then it's not so great. So it's a very thoughtful law. They just changed it last year, and or maybe even this year, I don't remember. It allows for the prescription of controlled substances except for opioids, except you can prescribe an opioid agonist used to treat or manage opioid dependence. So it's very thoughtful in terms of using telehealth in the opioid crisis, except it's got a carve out of all of that to say that it still has to adhere to federal law, and Ryan Haidt is still on the books. So that still says, well, that's great for all of that, but it's still against federal law to write that prescription. Before I move on to some of the other states, I mean, that puts prescribers in kind of a precarious situation, because if let's say you're treating a patient that's in Indiana and you're an Indiana licensed physician, let's say you're even located in Indiana, all of that is an in-state transaction. So maybe you're balancing what's the risk that anyone is going to say anything about this anyway, and what's the risk that DEA is going to know. Well, if you have a prescription drug monitoring program, then you're going to have to add that prescription into the database, and then it's a question of whether or not your state is releasing that data to the federal government, and then you get to the point of, does DEA care? And that's a point that I'll make down the road a little bit, but just get on to two more states. So this is the opposite end of the spectrum. New Hampshire, by contrast, says that you cannot prescribe Schedule 2 through 4 controlled substances except non-opioids for people that you've already seen in person, which is really like a follow-up exception, or maybe a refill exception. And then prescribing any drug to a patient who's already in a substance abuse and mental health services administration certified state opioid treatment program. So that's a very limited exception, even though I think that is more meaningful than some other states. And then you have Connecticut. I mean, Connecticut just says you can't, period. So that one is not necessarily that thoughtful. And so there are some takeaways from just the short period of these slides. The first being that you have to look at the state laws that are applicable, and that's going to be the laws in the state where the patient resides, but it's also going to be the laws of the state where you're licensed, because if you're worried about a prescription that you write may may come back to you in the form of the Board of Medicine saying, hey, what are you writing this prescription for? We say that you can't write that. You know, you've got to be mindful of that, and you have to understand what's your risk that that's going to happen. One example is abortion-causing drugs. There are a number of states, there aren't that many, and one actually, one state just in the last year took the law off of its books because of a constitutional argument. But there are a couple of states that say you cannot prescribe an abortion-causing drug through telehealth. And because it's only a handful of states, it's very easy that you could miss it. So, you know, it's important to really keep track of these things. Opioids for chronic pain or any other, even chronic pain management is a carve out in a lot of states. They won't allow you to prescribe a drug for the treatment of chronic pain management through telehealth. And a lot of states are very specific to opioids. In Indiana, you have that opioid agonist language. I think that that's language that's going to catch on. I think we're going to see more states talk about opioid agonists because the kind of the paradox is that methadone and buprenorphine are both opioids, but they're used to treat opioid abuse disorder. So, I mean, they're considered opioid agonists, and I think that that's a term you're going to start to hear a lot more. The second takeaway, which is something that we talked about in the green room before, is that congresspersons are becoming more aware of this. Industry is becoming more aware and exerting pressure. I'm trying to remember, there was a letter written to DEA by an industry advocate not that long ago, you know, pushing for the special registration. There's a letter written by senators in Alaska and Missouri. Excuse me, I said letters from industry ATA. It's not actually ATA. Sorry about that. It's another industry participant. But the idea is that it's on people's radar finally. And one thing that, you know, even if you see these states that are coming out and saying you prescribe whatever you want, you still have to be aware that Ryan Haidt is on the books. However, I'm going to skip down to the last point here. Enforcement is a licensure issue. It's not really a DEA enforcement issue. And I say that because, and I looked this up today actually, there hasn't been a Ryan Haidt enforcement by DEA since like 2013. So it's been a really long time, maybe 2014. And even then, the last case that I read, the ALJ, the administrative law judge who hears the cases that a federal agency brings, said that the bar was pretty high in terms of the proof that DEA has to bring of a violation, because you can't just say, well, you know, the patient was in state A and you live in state B. That's not enough. It's very easy that a physician, if they're licensed in state A, could fly to state A and treat a patient if they wanted to. So DEA actually has to show that that didn't happen, or at least, you know, this one case talked about that, and that's a really high bar. So I think the enforcement risk under DEA is pretty low, and of the cases that are brought, a lot of them stem from a physician doing a fair number of things wrong. And most of those things come out of the state board of medicine, where you've got, you know, you've got certain prohibitions or certain standards of care that are set by the board of medicine. And if you're not in accordance with those, there's nothing that's going to keep them from calling the DEA and saying, hey, would you like to pursue enforcement on this case? So, you know, those are some of the takeaways. If I were a physician, I still wouldn't be that comfortable prescribing a controlled substance through telehealth. I think that there obviously are physicians out there doing it, and it's a licensure issue. You know, it's a risk for you. I can appreciate that you're doing what you think is best for your patients, but it's still a risk, and it's one that, in my opinion, is not that hard to get rid of. We just have to change the law, and I think that a lot of people are behind it, but it's still there. So that's it for me. I'll open it up for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was really insightful, by the way. Thank you so much. We got tons of questions pouring in. Maybe for the audience members, please just like post, we'll just take them as many as we can. So we have one question from Vienna. So she's asking, can you comment specific about in California laws and the specific psychiatrists, are they allowed to prescribe without the physical encounter first?
California is a really good question, because a few years ago, they recently updated their website, and now none of the links that I had saved work. You have to find that content. And the Board of Medicine used to have all of their meeting minutes and all of their newsletters, and I think it was in a newsletter, someone from the Board of Medicine basically said, we don't distinguish between controlled substances and non-controlled substances. Okay. You're the physician. If you feel that prescribing a drug is within the standard of care and that you have the information that you need, then it's not a problem from our perspective. Okay. And I think that's probably safe to say. If you're a psychiatrist, I'm not aware of any carve out or any difference in California in terms of what you can and cannot prescribe. The only difference being that you're kind of uniquely situated in this situation to provide all of the care that that an individual would need. You wouldn't need to partner with someone else to do the counseling if you wanted to do that yourself as well. But in terms of the remote prescribing, I mean, from California's perspective, I don't think that there is an issue as long as you're doing all the things that you have to do to establish the relationship. And that's going to be, I mean, that's an asterisk to every single thing that I say today. You have to establish the appropriate relationship in accordance with state law. Some states are going to require two-way audio visual. Some are going to say you can establish a relationship based on store and forward technology. Almost every state is going to have, but I actually don't think California is going to say you cannot establish a relationship based on a questionnaire alone. So there you go. Sorry.
Okay, appreciate it. So I have a question from Gerald. So he's asking, so let's say he's a nurse practitioner examining a patient in a different state. So now he's connected by telemedicine live video with this patient. Now, does that constitute a doctor-patient relationship?
You're going to love this answer. It depends. Nurse practitioners are a really good example of it depends, because in some states, I think Tennessee, you have independent rights to treat, to create that relationship, and to prescribe. But in other states, you still have to act under the guidance and under the relationship that you have to establish with a primary physician. So it's going to depend on the state that you're in and the state that the patient is in. And I would assume you've got to have independence in both states.
Okay.
In order for that to work.
Got it. Okay. Got it. Okay. Then we have a question from Stacy. So she's asking, I mean, since you have the Ryan Heiss Act, doesn't all states have to defer to that? So what that means, you have to have a face-to-face exam first. I mean, I guess doesn't the federal law like trumps the state laws, where it's like opposite one?
Yeah, and that's kind of my point in all this. No one has what we're talking about is called preemption. no one has made the claim, even though I think from a legal perspective that there is a valid claim to say that perhaps DEA does not have the power under the Constitution to prohibit this conduct, because licensure of medicine has traditionally been a state issue.
Okay.
That's a big, long constitutional debate. And I think the very short answer is that she's right, that right now there is a big concern, and certainly DEA thinks it has the power to regulate in this way, that federal law is going to, for lack of a better word, trump state law. So it's really an enforcement question for physicians that want to continue to prescribe in this way.
Okay, got it. Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, now this messiness is making our life very difficult.
Yeah.
You should just come out, just say it. So I guess now a follow, I have a question on John. So he's asking, so I mean, I know this, like, when do you think the DEA will, publish and publicly release the details?
8 years ago. I really hope that it's going to happen in the next year. I think that we're getting more and more pressure, and I think that's the only way that it will happen, is if there's enough pressure. The opioid crisis is so bad, and we have a president who has made a lot of statements saying that the administration is going to do something about this crisis. We have some senators on board. I think we need more. I think, write your senator. I think it really does come down to that. And if there's a strong enough movement, I think that it can happen within a year.
Okay, let's. That'd be very cool.
Yeah. And then I'll post this on my LinkedIn page for the next 10 years.
Okay, we'll be cheering for you. Hopefully you can lead the charge, make it happen. That will definitely it'll be so wonderful. So we have another question from Stacy. So she's asking, what about prescribing very small doses of testosterone for like postmenopausal women? Does that fall, or does that fall?
I don't know well enough whether all forms of testosterone are controlled. And it's certainly a fair point to say that states often will have their own schedules that are a little bit different from the federal controlled substance schedules. So a state could say, so many grams or milligrams of a certain drug would not be considered, a Schedule 4. Excuse me. But I just don't know. But in terms of federal controlled substance schedules, I'm pretty sure that it's just an all or none, that it's not based on the amount. I mean, it's several pages of just lists of drugs. So, I've never gone through it with a fine-tooth comb to see. It's possible, but I doubt it.
Okay, got it. So we have a question for Alan. So he's asking, so he's a physician. Let's say he lives in Idaho. So he see a patient by telemedicine in Idaho. So he also have a license in Oregon. Then he see patient in Oregon in there. Now, in those cases, so does that mean so he need to conform to the law of both Idaho as well as Oregon, or is only based on who the patient is, or maybe only based on who the physician is?
As always, it depends. But here's what it depends on. So if you're talking about the relationship you establish with a patient within the state, let's say you are physically in Idaho, you've got a license in Idaho, the patient's in Idaho. Idaho is all you have to worry about. In terms of, let's say, Utah is another state that you're licensed in, and Utah has, I think that they have a non-abortion inducing drug prohibition. And if you were to prescribe that to a patient in Iowa or Idaho, is that what we were saying, Idaho?
Yeah.
I think it comes down to enforcement risk. if, for whatever reason, that story was published in every newspaper in the country, and the Utah Board of Medicine learned that you had written that prescription, I think that they probably could have the power to bring an enforcement action against you, which is really going to be a licensure issue. It's not going to, it's very unlikely that it would be a criminal or civil action, and I would have to look to even see if they have the power. Most boards of medicine, maybe all of them, do not have the power to bring criminal charges. But in terms of your license, they probably could take your license in that state, and then that would be something that you'd have to report every time you want to get a license in another state. So it's certainly a pain. But barring a story about it coming out in the New York Times, it's not likely that another board of medicine would even know about such a prescription.
Got it. Okay, understood. So I have a question from EMSA. So she's asking, so right now there's a lot of popularity using telemedicine to authorize durable medical equipment and also non-control, like the topical pain reliever and stuff across state lines in there. Like, do you see any legal issue with that? Would that just clear? Is this okay? Like,
I mean, there are always legal issues that we can find, because it's what we're talking about is this little part of telehealth and telemedicine and remote prescribing. So if you're talking about prescribing creams, a lot of times you're talking about compounded drugs, and that's certainly something that has been a hot topic under the new FDA Commissioner Gottlieb. So last Friday, a new guidance document was established on compounding drugs and through outsourcing facilities, which means you're talking about the use of bulk substances. I don't have the time today to go through that whole guidance, but certainly if that's something that you're interested in doing, and certainly there are companies out there doing that right now, it's a guidance that you want to read and understand, because you want to know, as a practitioner, are you going to have any issue obtaining that that compounded product from the pharmacy that you're using? Because the pharmacy may read that and say, well, these ingredients, 1 or 2 or 3 of them are not on the bulk substances list, and we're not going to make this for you because we don't want the FDA to cause an enforcement action or give us a 483 or something else. So that's one issue, and I can't remember the other example that was given. Milton, in the question she said like creams, and before that she said something else.
Like a durable goods.
DME. I mean, DMEs very often are prescribed to hospitals or through hospitals. So it's less of a telehealth heavy area. If you were, I guess if you're in wound care and you've got, like a telehealth practice where patients who don't think they have to go to the hospital, but certainly they've got to take care of this big wound that they have. They're using their iPhone, or they're sending you pictures through Store and Forward. I'm not aware of any issue. The only time that you would maybe have to be a little more diligent is when that product, that DME, is a combination product, so it's going to have a drug in it as well. Okay. I'm not aware of any DME that has a controlled substance, but it's something to think about, I guess.
Yeah, great. So we have a question from Phil. I thought this was really a great question. So suppose you have a patient that's referred by their PCP in there. So of course PCP has done the physical exam, is in person in there. Then they refer this to a psychiatrist. So now psychiatrist is remote. And then, of course, psychiatrist has to review the medical record of the physical exam. Now, does that constitute face-to-face already, or does this need to be examined by the psychiatrist in person?
That's a great question. In terms of Ryan Height, I don't have it in front of me, but there are certainly referral exceptions. I'm
Okay.
not aware of an exception that that is going to work without having a physician next to the patient. I think they'd have to be in a hospital for you to, to have like a tablet and have a visit through two-way audio visual with them, and then you could write the script. But basically what you're doing is recommending to the hospital, because even though you do it through Ryan Height, I mean, why even take the risk? Just tell the hospital to write it.
I see. In this case, you're telling the PCP to actually write that prescription.
Right, because the PCP is looking for the consult, and so you're providing consultation services, which is actually different from, establishing that relationship directly with the patient.
Got it. What if it's not? What if it's like the patient first see the PCP in person, now then they refer them. So now the idea now is by telemedicine, like
Right.
now the PCP no longer involved.
Right, and that's where I think Ryan Height, it still doesn't pass the scrutiny, but a
Okay.
number of states have exceptions for that
Got it.
situation where you are there are a lot of exceptions for coverage where you're in the same practice.
Mm.
There are other states that have some exceptions for consult,
Mm.
but I'd have to look at them. I mean, I think that they may still be envisioning the consultation occurring through the PCP rather than
Sounds good.
along the side of them.
Got it.
It's a good question though, and
Yeah.
if you think that that's a model that you're interested in pursuing, I mean, definitely reach out to someone to ask that question. And that's something that not just me. I mean, any or any lawyer.
Mm.
I can't tell you how many times we get a startup and we've already billed them for how many thousands of dollars when we finally say, hey, you've never asked us to look into your model. Do you want us to find out whether you can actually legally do this? And sometimes they say, no, we got separate counsel for that, which we're always afraid of. We want the control. We want to know ourselves. But other times they'll say, oh yeah, I didn't think of that. And then you find out we wasted a lot of money, or we could have designed the product that you're going to be providing in a different way so that you're not changing your model depending on what state you are, which is always easier. I mean, easier to have one model that fits every state.
Yeah. I mean, I would say if you could even write some sort of white paper around that type of country, you have a huge number. So I guess the telemedicine, right, roughly into these sort of two class. One is direct to consumer, like just someone go to an app and the thing. So we actually believe that like a probably equally even bigger workflow is actually the patient has some physician, nurse, whatever, the doctor remote. So it's not that sort of pure direct to consumer, but it's like provider extension type of model. I think having clarity around that, I know we get a lot of questions about like those type of thing. I think that would be a desperate need a white paper you can write on the top of Google search.
I'll float it. We'll see. Yeah, and I definitely think there are a lot more models coming out where you don't just get a physician on the other side. That there's a lot more on the patient's side in terms of you've got to produce all of this information, and then we'll have a physician review it, and then we'll set up a session if necessary in order to establish that relationship. But I think that's another model that is going to grow because you're limiting the physician's time.
Okay, great. So we have a question from Yan. This one is really interesting question. So she's asking, so in terms of like the legal position of doctor prescribing internationally, so specifically it's a case, for example, let's say you have a patient in China who come to the US to see the doctor in the US and they get everything. Now the patient now went back to China, but now the doctor need to prescribe this or follow up in there. Now is that like okay or not okay?
I actually have someone that called me not that long ago with a similar question for tourists.
Yeah.
So I'm not aware of anything that really answers the question, but as a physician, you're licensed within a certain state. You're in terms of another country. I mean, if it's China, again, everything kind of boils down to what's the enforcement risk. But the person flies back to China and you prescribe them something. Where is that patient going to fill the prescription? Likely a pharmacy. Is that pharmacy going to accept your prescription? So those are kind of practical questions you have to answer before you even worry about, is there an enforcement risk? And I want to say that is probably a pretty unique circumstance. If you have a whole practice built around people that are flying back and forth, that's a pretty unique practice. And you might do well to get an attorney to write to the Board of Medicine anonymously. That's why you use the attorney, so you can do it anonymously. And just say, hey, is there any issue with this? As long as I'm writing the script in accordance with the law of the state. Now, if you want to do something that's not within the confines of the laws of that state, if you're in California and you want to do something that the Board of Medicine has said, don't do this, then you're putting your license at risk. Maybe you can argue that it shouldn't apply because the patient is in a different country, but when you establish the relationship, they were here. So that's going to be a tougher one.
Got it. So can I ask a follow-up question? We actually have two law firms came to our show. They express like a difference opinion on this. I'm hoping you could be a tiebreaker. So specifically, let's say I'm a physician. I'm in California. I have a patient. It's my regular patient in there. Now my patient go on a business trip, went to New York or whatever in there. So I do not have a license in that particular state. Could I still prescribe something just during that thing? And then the reason I asked this with the two law firms, one says like, no, you couldn't do it. Another one says yes, because it's like, so what's
Well, it actually depends on the state where the person is. In some states, they will, I think Tennessee, I think I used them for another example, but I think in Tennessee or in Washington, I'm pretty sure in Washington state, you can practice without a license issued by the Washington Board of Medicine, as long as you have a valid license in another state, and only for something like up to 15 days per year. So it's very limited, but we've seen more of those states popping up or more states turning that way, not a lot more. And knowing New York, they probably are not going to have a law like that on the books. But if you're going into one of those states, then it's not going to be an issue. The pharmacy might still give you some pushback, but to the extent that the law of that state will allow you to do it, you can call the pharmacy and say, hey, look up this law. If they're a big pharmacy like CVS, they're going to have counsel that they can call and be like, hey, can you verify this is true? And then you can write the script and have it filled. But without one of those laws, I mean, now you're talking about remote prescribing across the state lines, and states are going to differ in that context as well. Surprisingly, we don't have more uniformity in remote prescribing laws.
Got it. Like, do you know any case where someone was brought up in any state where, the argument was that this is my patient, I have known this patient for years, and they just happen to go on a vacation in there. So in that case, it's like no exception.
I've never heard of like an enforcement action against their license or something like that. Really what happens in that situation, I mean, if you're not licensed in New York or wherever they are, the Board of Medicine can't take your license because you don't have it. Unlikely that that's going to be, something the attorney general or someone else wants to take up, unless you're doing it a lot. If
Yeah.
pharmacy said, look, this guy
Yeah.
keeps calling in prescriptions and
Yeah.
doesn't have a license here, the attorney general will sue you for something. They'll come up with something. But otherwise, no, I don't see a one-time prescription having much enforcement risk. It's more of a pain in the neck for the patient, because if the pharmacy won't fill it, they've got to figure out a way, and then you've got to have a consult, and it's just a pain.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense in there. So right now we have another question from actually two people asked similar question, Lorena and Rich asking. So can you talk a bit about prescribing sort of stimulants by telemedicine, specific things like maybe a child with ADHD? If this under control or non-control, is like or any regulation?
I'm actually not aware of what I'm going to see if I can get it right now. Whether they are, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, I'm not sure, but let's see. Oops. But what I do want to say, though, is that you're going to run into, yeah, this looks like it's definitely controlled. Okay. You're going to run into additional issues, because whenever you're prescribing for a child, you're going to have the proper consent. And that's something that I would just advocate across the board. Whenever you have a telehealth or telemedicine relationship, even in states that don't require it, why not just get their consent? Put it in your terms of service of your website and make sure that there's some sort of a form that they say, yes, I consent to receiving my, my healthcare through telemedicine, which is kind of stupid anyway, because they wouldn't be on your website, talking to you if they didn't consent. But get it in writing, and then you don't have to worry about it. But in terms of treating kids, you've got to have the patients, you've got to have their parents' consent, and that is easier when they're in your office and they have the kid's insurance card and everyone's last name is the same, and you can see how they interact together. You can tell if there are red flags. Through telehealth, it is more difficult to establish that the consent is valid. So that to me is another stumbling block that you've got to be really thoughtful about how you navigate.
Got it. Really appreciate that. Again, we're coming to the end of the hour, but thank you so much for the really, really wonderful discussion. Maybe what we'll do is we'll just ask you 3 really rapid fire questions to wrap. The first one is, you share so many interesting things in that. I think you're based on the registration, you can tell you're very popular.
Okay.
So if you can only, if the audience can only learn one thing from you, what do you want the audience to learn from you?
Just to think ahead. If you think that a patient that starts describing symptoms that are going to require, or in your medical opinion, are going to require a controlled substance to be issued, I wouldn't issue it right away if you haven't done the background research to find out what the enforcement risk is. If you're in a state that says you can't do it, that on top of Ryan Haidt, it is not a good situation.
Got it. And this second question is, what is something that you believe in about telehealth that the rest of the world do not believe yet?
I don't know that the rest of the world doesn't believe it. I actually think, this is funny, I don't think that I've shared this really. I came from the pharmaceutical side. I worked for 2 pharmaceutical companies before I joined the firm. And I think that there is going to be a way, not today, not tomorrow, probably not for a couple of years, that clinical trials are going to be done remotely in the future. And I don't mean, remote monitoring. I mean the whole thing.
That makes a lot of sense. In fact, we exhibit at the DIA conference, and they will have a lot of plans. It's just another on top of it, but there's a huge bunch of regulations that are scary in there. But I do think that would be huge. That would be the value of discovery would be massive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, then the last question is, so if you could whisper a single idea into President Trump's ear, what would you want him to do?
It's this special registration. I mean, I know I keep harping on it,
Yeah,
but open up the special
yeah,
registration, and then we can argue over how
yeah.
DA promulgates those rules, but at least there's
At least
some entrance.
got it. That makes a lot of sense. Again, so Anne, if you could bring up the closing announcements. Okay, again, Brad, thank you so much for the wonderful discussion. Again, for the audience member, again, so we're coming up to the American Telemedicine Association show again, so we're about a month away. We're pretty excited. I hope all of you guys can come to ATA, come to Chicago, meet us in there. Again, so we have a really exciting, we have a bunch of interesting talk inside our booth. So this year we have the biggest booth of the entire show. We have a lot of just our partners that coming to speak, the interesting insights. So again, if you're interested in whether exhibiting inside our booth or give a talk inside our booth, please contact us. We're locking the slots pretty imminently. Like just contact us right away to get a spot, and you get to leverage our promotion mechanism to promote your service in there. Then our annual conference, Telehealth Failure Success, again, we're opening up for registration. Plus, if you know interesting speakers and everything, plus definitely come, lock in the dates. One more thing about our ATA conference, we actually, through one of our partners, we're going to do a startup competition. We actually have a partnership with a venture capital firm, actually. So it'll be judges, some, pretty high level judges. We're going to run that shows again. So definitely send us the detail if you want to pitch inside our booth. Again, maybe get some startup capital for your fund, like let us know. And then in our international work, we're going to hold a conference in the Philippines at end of January. So this will be geared out towards Southeast Asia, where we're designing the motorcycle, the boat, all this thing. If you're interested, definitely get involved on that. And then we're pretty excited. So we'll be launching a countrywide uh, artificial intelligence and machine learning competition in partnership with Amazon, and it will be held in Vietnam. We're actually going to get expect to get a couple of thousand these sort of like college plus graduate level students become AI experts. So part of our ambition to create an army of people to do AI machine learning. Again, so if you have problems you want someone to solve, send us a note in there. We're pretty excited. We have a bunch of notes from payers, from big hospital. So again, our approach is there's like the IBM Watson solving the grand challenge in there, which like only IBM product could do. So for us, we're looking for low hanging fruits, right? It's not about applying machine learning to solve practical problem that we have an impact like right away, like that type of things. We got a bunch of pretty interesting problems. So again, if you're interested in a problem you want us to solve, let us know. You're interested to become a sponsor or judge, we'll plan the trip we'll be holding in Vietnam. We'll let you know the dates for that. Again, we've been making a lot of progress for those our medical insurance co-op ideas. We have, unfortunately, we couldn't announce, yeah, we have some really household name that's involved and we're working with them to potentially put this into place. So again, so definitely come us write this blueprint with us. And then again, so our next video podcast will be on April 11th. And again, so we're going to focus on in terms of value-based and some futures of Dr. Luke in there. You're going to find that pretty insightful, forward-looking. And plus, we have a bunch of just big name speakers coming up. We have from IBM Watson's chief architect, chief science coming up. So we have some interesting talk from Amazon, Uber, and Lyft, how we're combining telemedicine plus physical movement in a single workflow. So really interesting work we're doing with some of our partners. You can hear some of the results coming up. Again, so thank you so much for everyone tuning in. And again, Brad, thank you so much for sharing insight. That was absolutely wonderful. I learned so much from you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Happy to be here. And I'll be at ATA as well.
Oh, excellent. Come to our booth.
I will.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.